All right, Peter Schrager, Good Morning Football. He's got a podcast for iHeartRadio. What's going on, buddy?
Yeah, doing great, Kev. I'm so appreciative of you having me on. You mentioned the podcast. We're all doing the podcast. I've got one for iHeart called The Season with Peter
The
Schrager. And a lot
season.
of it is coaches and GMs. And we do all the interviews like a database of all these candidates that are being interviewed now. So it's pretty cool to see a lot of these names popping up.
My favorite part of the season was when you had Quezzy on about a year and a half ago. And I realized at that moment, Quezzy's, I think, much smarter than both of us. I think we could both agree.
Hmm.
But he is one of us in the sense that he said that the coolest thing that happened to him in his formative years was when he got to meet Dave Jacoby from Grantland and The Ringer at like Sloan. And he was like, "Oh, I get to meet all these people. Jacoby was there." And I was like, "Yes, he is one of us."
Totally. And Kwesi, who's the GM of the Vikings, his
Yeah.
story is so cool in that he was working in the finance world, but had
Yeah.
this like burning interest to get into it. And I think you and I, we love those stories of the guy that doesn't necessarily have to be in football and doesn't necessarily have to take the giant pay cut to do it, but chooses to do it. It's why I've always respected Arthur Smith.
Yeah.
His father
Billionaire.
owns FedEx, is a billionaire, and he's like, no, I'm going to be the quality control coach of the Washington Redskins instead. That's what I want to do because that's my passion and that's my path. Kwesi is similar. He could be making seven figures as a managing director at one of these banks on Wall
Yeah.
Street. He worked his way up in the San Francisco organization and now he's running the Vikings.
Andrew Barry too. I did a story a couple years ago about Barry, and like I think it was his coach at Harvard was just like, "Man, you sure you want to do this? You sure you want to drive people to the airport? Like you can go be a director at Goldman Sachs in 2 years, buddy. Like it's crazy." But
Yeah.
whatever. We it's people who can't live without it, and we can't live without it. But we can't live without the media part of it, which is much sadder and far less lucrative. But we'll leave it at that.
It's far less
Um,
lucrative, far sad, and also much more combative. I feel like every time I open my mentions, I don't even know what I say on the air anymore. It's just people
yeah.
angry, and I'm like, all right, just stay
Well,
focused, dude. Stay
a lot of
focused.
it, I agree with you. A lot of it is detective work where you're like, wait, why are they, what did I say? What are they mad at me for? Like, what? I don't, and then you're
Can
like,
I get?
oh, I said this a week ago. Okay, I
Can I
got
give
it.
you? Can I give you? Okay, so obviously the freezing cold take thing is one thing where you say something in August or
Yeah.
September, and that's fine. There's some that are just like not even, and you have to really do some digging. So I guess on Monday's show, we're recording this after the divisional round, the Mark
Yeah.
Andrews play. Kyle, my colleague, Kyle Brandt,
We
who
love
I
him.
love and I share an office and studio with, came on and said, hey, if Mark Andrews completes that pass on the 2-point conversion, there's a really good chance that the Ravens go to overtime and win that game. I turn on my phone or check my mentions on Twitter
Yeah.
after the show, and there's thousands, and it's venom from Bills
Yeah.
fans who are not the nicest to me. Whatever. There's just venom. And I'm like, well, what is this all about? Someone who didn't post the clip, someone wrote that, hey, P. Schrags, my Twitter handle, says that Josh Allen wouldn't have come back down with a minute 33 and two timeouts left, that
Yeah.
the game was over and that they would have lost. But like, they don't. And everyone just responded off that. And I'm like, I wasn't me. It wasn't
Yeah.
even me. It wasn't even me. Yeah. But that's it.
You shouldn't have said it. You shouldn't have said that about Josh.
I know,
I don't know. That's on you. That's on you, buddy. All right, let's get to a couple of things around the NFL right now. We're recording this at lunchtime on Tuesday. It sounds like we know which way the Jets thing is headed, but we'll get to that in a second. I want to start with Ben Johnson, who I think at one point in this cycle, every single team's fan base thought they had Ben Johnson. They're making the Ben Johnson Photoshops. The Photoshop industry is booming. Although, from what I understand, it's just AI now. We used to be a proper country and build
Is that
things
right?
and do Photoshop, and now people are just putting it in Grok, and they've got Marcus Freeman coaching the Bears or whatever, and it's like, come on, man, this used to take a long time. Now the problem is it's just too quick with AI. We're gonna have too many Photoshops. Having said that, Ben Johnson goes to Chicago. Diana Rossini said he didn't like the setup in Jacksonville. I think we know what setup is code word for. I hear you, Diana. But he goes to Chicago. We know what the setup is there, but we also know who the quarterback is, Caleb Williams. I know Ben Johnson. I'm sure I spent some time with him. What is Chicago getting?
Well, there's this perception that Ben is like this evil genius sitting in a lab who doesn't have any social skills and is just this like arrogant, I'm going to do what I can to embarrass your team while I draw up plays at 3 in the morning. And
Yeah.
I can't wait to unveil it on all of your fans. And that's not necessarily the case. He's actually a really Intelligent guy, yes, but
Intelligent guy.
he's pretty social too, and like a
Yep.
normal dude. 38 years old, 3 kids, like normal. And I think the rub on or the rap on him was that like he was being a little too selective the past few years, or that he was treating himself like some sort of diva because he wasn't running to jobs, and that's so unusual in the NFL that he was content. Remember, 3 kids, had them in Detroit for a few years now, and the Carolina job 2 years ago, I think very well could have been his. That was the year they hired Frank Reich down there in Carolina. David Tepper,
Yeah.
for all his faults as an owner, you might think he zeroed in on, I like that guy. And there's Carolina ties because he was a UNC guy. They were going to have the first pick overall. They had a lot of things that were going on with them. And I think he said, I'm good. I'm backing off from this thing. I'm going to go back to Detroit. There's still some unfinished business. Last year, multiple teams were very interested in him. And it seemed like the Washington marriage was going to make a lot of sense. And he went through that first interview. And then the story goes, there was a flight that the Washington brass, including Bob Myers and the owner and Adam Peters, were headed to Detroit. And that flight was planned. And before that flight could land or even take off, he withdrew his name. And the word that I got was they found that out, not from Ben Johnson himself, but from other parties. They had to be the last team to hire a coach in the cycle because of that. Yeah. And it just so turns out they got Dan Quinn and are in the NFC Championship game. So there's no real loser in that situation. Now we go to this year, and Ben puts on this performance of epic proportions this season with trick plays, and they pile on the Cowboys on national TV, and they pile it on the Bears in Chicago, and does the fake Goff fall and the fake Gibbs fall. And that was done in front of them. And I heard in November, when Eberflus was fired, I heard in November that Ben Johnson was their number 1 target. And my thought was, well, obviously he's the guy, he's the belle of the ball. But then you started hearing other things in the last couple of weeks. And I will back up my colleagues at NFL Network, Ian Rappaport, and I believe Tom Pelissero, who both said that there's a lot of buzz around Vegas. I was doing the same reporting there. And the reason that made so much sense was that it was a clean slate. Yeah. Yes, he didn't have a quarterback, but it's no GM. There's no brass that's all jockey. It's like a brand new.
There are literally no cooks in the kitchen.
There are zero cooks in the kitchen. There are zero, and it's almost like an expansion franchise in Vegas because they got rid of Telesco before they even had a coach. So no GM. Brady's brand new, is playing a big role, and the word was that Brady really enjoyed watching Ben Johnson's offense, and the two of them are going to hit it off. Well, they did the Zoom. They had many conversations, and it all seemed like that made a lot of sense. But at the end of the day, they didn't have Caleb Williams. And I think all along, Ben Johnson saw that quarterback, saw that market, and saw that opportunity with that logo. And that's a real logo for football diehards, the Bears logo, and said, I'll take that challenge on. Real quick, though, I'm getting crushed because I said it's a home run hire. Kevin, it is a home run hire.
Who's crushing you?
There's Packers people fans? Saying, no, it's everyone saying, let's see how this guy does. That's not my point. I don't know if he's a home run head coach. It's a home run hire in that he was the belle of the ball, maybe 3 years in a row. And the belle of the ball chose the Chicago Bears. You know how rare that is? He chose to go to Chicago. This is not them settling on the 7th head coach hire. Like, this was the guy, and he's picking the Bears. For me, it was a monstrous deal that he actually chose them over other opportunities and didn't even interview with several. Like, the Jets didn't even get a chance to meet with Ben Johnson. He was just like, I'm not interested from the start. So I think it's a really cool day in Chicago.
Completely agree with you. I mean, if you're saying you can't say it's a home run hire, then you're saying you can't judge any hire. You're just saying that we just have to wait 3 years and then put in a grade. Like, no, we're in media. We have to immediately grade the process. Like, I always say, like, if I can't judge the results, I'm going to judge the process. And the process is really good for the Bears right now. And they never make this hire. They haven't made a good hire since I was in high school. They've hired weird people like Mark Trestman. They've hired weird people like Matt Eberflus. They've hired also Rans like John Fox. I think that, especially after the success Doug Peterson had, you could sell Matt Nagy. I could understand why that would be a good hire. It didn't work out. That's fine. But they've never had this hyped a coaching prospect, as you just said. Like, They never do this. They never, frankly, I think it's probably because they don't go out and they pay top of market. I mean,
No,
one
yeah.
thing David Tepper does is he makes everybody extremely rich, which is why people still take those jobs. And by the way, I think they figured out with Canales and
We think,
Dan
yeah.
Morgan and Brent Tillis.
And
I mean,
guess
hey, it's
what?
better than it
Guess
has been.
what? Those hires were universally mocked and looked at as the worst of the. I think Bryce Young looked pretty good. Guess what? Dan Quinn last year was the last coach hired. He was hired on February 5th. And people were
They
like,
made him fly commercial.
like, like, we don't know. We don't
We have no
know.
idea. We have no
But
idea.
if you're talking about all the pretty girls at the
Yeah.
school and the prettiest girl at the school in that school dance, it's Ben Johnson. And that prettiest girl at the school dance chose the Chicago Bears over other options. That's a big deal.
I want to talk about Aaron Glenn for 1 second. We don't know what's going to happen here. It's possible. It was great. We had Kyle Long on yesterday, and he was like, well, here's how I fix the Bears. Start with Ben Johnson. And I was like, great. I'm glad you said that, because an hour later they hired Ben Johnson, and we got to use the clip, and we didn't have to do any weird mumbo jumbo with editing, because Kyle Long started with Ben Johnson. Then he did some great stuff about ownership. But he's meeting with the Jets on Tuesday. Ian Rappaport says the plan is not let him out of the building. I was thinking about Aaron Glenn last week, because with Dan Campbell, I did a big Dan Campbell story a couple years ago, and there was a quote in there that I've thought about since the day I got it. And it was, players know a fraud immediately. Players can see a fraud immediately. They can sniff it out. And the moment you do anything fraudulent, players are the first to know. Okay? Paraphrase. That quote about Dan Campbell was from Aaron Glenn.
Nice.
Because he understands what players respond to, just like Dan does. There's an authenticity there. And every time, so I think we talked 3 consecutive summers, and I was looking back at my notebooks, and what I liked about it was everything he said was realistic. So there was 2 years ago, I said, what's the goal for the defense? He said, top half of the NFL, top 16 defense. And I'm thinking, it's August 5th, and you see so much BS in this league, Peter, about, hey, we're going to be aggressive. We're going to attack. And Aaron Glenn's looking at his guys saying, we got a young defense. We got holes here. We're going to be top half. That's what we're going for. And they did it. But there's a directness and an authenticity. And he said that he loves working with young players. He's not scared of them. He's going to take risks on defense, just personnel-wise and scheme-wise. We've seen that. I just think that whoever lands him, and it sounds like the Jets are the leaders in the clubhouse, are getting a guy. I think it's really hard to replicate the Dan Campbell experience, because anybody across from the owner can say we value culture. But until I don't even know if you can do it in year one. You can fake culture for a year, but until the bullets start flying, you don't know. But if anybody can replicate the Dan Campbell experience, to me, it's Aaron Glenn.
Dude, I value a lot of different people in this league's opinions, and I come off as a sycophant sometimes for Sean Payton because we work so closely together for a year. But 2 of the people that I respect most in this league are 2 guys that I worked with in Fox extensively. The first one is Chris Spielman, who I was his sideline reporter on a Fox crew. We used to do the number 4 game. It was Tom Brenneman, Chris Spielman, and myself. And
was that a lot of like Tampa Bay hotels?
Oh, a lot of Tampa. Yeah. You want to talk about that Tampa Bay Hyatt? We can.
Oh yeah.
You know, a lot of.
Let's get you back on track. Sorry about that. I was just guessing what. We had Jason McCourty on ESPN Radio a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about.
I saw his slate this
year. Vegas and Nashville, just over and over again. Vegas
Jason,
and Nashville.
You want to call NFL games? All right, let's let 7 other crews pick the locations, and then you get your assignments. That's how that worked out for McCourty in his first year. Anyway. Instead of us talking about whether you go in the main hotel or you choose one of those cool casitas at the Hyatt in Tampa, which is an option for anyway, if you know, you know. Anyway, we go back to it. Spielman gets the job with Detroit about 3 years ago. And this is when they were awful and they hired Dan Campbell. And it's like, we have to do something here. It's 2021. And at the combine, like, you're not allowed as a media person to walk the actual concourse in the combine and pop yourself into these rooms. But Spielman doesn't know any better. And he's just got this new job as like the number 2 to the owner and Rod Wood, the president, but also like a liaison to the coaches. He's just a face of the Lions. And he says, come to come to the combine room that we have. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't really
Yeah.
know. And he's like, just come by. And I'd known Brad Holmes from his LA days. So he was a warm face and all this thing. And I walk in and I could tell Aaron Glenn's like, why is there a media guy in my box right now? And like, not the warmest guy. Then Spielman's like, AG, come over here. It's a Schrager. He's like, no, we know each other, whatever. And like, Aaron was cool. And then like right back to the drills. And I'm like, oh, that dude's for real. And Spielman's like, he's the best. Like, that guy's the best. And I'm like, you just got to know. He's like, no. This guy's all ball. We fast forward 2 years later. I'm at Fox. Every different Sunday, it's Sean Payton talking about two guys, Parcells, who he worships, and Aaron Glenn, who's his guy, who's now the DC in Detroit, and he's so proud of what he's doing. And Aaron Glenn this and Aaron Glenn that. I've gotten to know Aaron a little bit. The Jets are going to find that they have what is the leader of men type. And that is what everyone said they needed. And I don't know. This process, we could talk about the process because I'm not sure it was a shortcut or this was the plan all along or whatever it was. But I've been very vocal that this was a very specific process with the Jets that they did not even interview Kellen Moore. They didn't even try to interview Kliff Kingsbury. They didn't even make the attempt to interview Todd Monken or Liam Cohen. Like those types of guys, like the offensive mastermind, we're just raving about Ben Johnson. Like that wasn't the top priority for this Jets process, or so it seems. I'm not a part of the 33rd team. I don't know what Tannenbaum and Spielman came in as their vision, but they were trying to find the next culture builder for the Jets if Aaron Glenn is ultimately the hire. So I say all this, I wouldn't look to the X's and O's, the defensive ranks, the 45 points that they just gave up. I would say Aaron Glenn has three great things going for him if he's the next Jets head coach. The fact that the people who vouch for him are Parcells, Spielman, Payton, go down the list. Every Jets luminary from years past, they rave about him. Fine. 2, and he actually revealed this in the Pivot podcast that he did with Ryan Clark. He's worn every hat possible. He was a scouting assistant. He was an assistant coach. He was a defensive backs coach. He worked for Cleveland. He worked for the Jets. And then he was finally defensive coordinator after his stint with the Saints. He's worn the different hats. And the last, but maybe most important thing is that he knows what he's walking into here. Yeah. Like there are 31 jobs and there's the Jets job. And if you're not ready for everything you could possibly imagine and more to come your direction, and you walk in blindly with Babe in Woods, deer in headlights type look, you're going to get run over real quick. And I'm not saying that happened to Saleh or that happened to Gase or that happened to those guys that precede them. I just think that Aaron Glenn is going in. If he takes this job, he knows full well, not only the market, not only the owner, but he knows the entire Jets thing and what it could be because he lived it with Parcells and what it's been, which has been the doldrums the last decade.
I just think the day in, day out pressure with the Jets is so different. I remember being in Cortland back in the Rex era when I was really young, and Dan Leberfield was arguing.
Jets whispers, shout him out
about something. I don't even remember what it was. It was something very small. As do you trust your secondary? Whatever, right? And Dan and Rex were just going at it, basically yelling at each other, just like at the podium, like full press conference. They were just going at it. And it's like August 3rd, okay? And they're just going at it. And Rex steps off the podium after they're done and looks at Leberfeld and says, "Is that all you got?" And just winked at him.
Yeah.
And he loved it. He loved it.
Yes.
And I think you actually have to have that mentality of oh, it's like with the New York media. I'm not locked in with you. You're locked in with me. And understanding there's a give and take there. Don't bully them. But Parcells was the master at knowing how to use the media and how they used to say this about Jeff Van Gundy with the Knicks, is that Van Gundy was the master at just saying one little thing that he knew the New York media was going to pick up on and run with it, and then have plausible deniability and go, "Oh, no, you guys did too much of that." You know damn well he knew what was going on the back page. You need a master of the media. You need a master of perception at that job. Aaron Glenn hasn't, just in my interactions with him, I feel I don't know if he's going to spar like Rex, but he's going to understand every day at the podium what message he needs to communicate.
Well, I think so. And, Todd Bowles isn't going to win any awards for quote of the year. Right. Adam Gase wasn't a media darling. Saleh had a lot of catchphrases and was really, warm to a lot of the media members and could speak to the team. And we saw him at Hard Knocks. There were a lot to I think Glenn comes in as like, you almost feel like he's a native New Yorker, even though he's a Texas A&M guy and a Texas guy, but like he wore that uniform. And I think again, I would stand from the mountaintops and be like, I think the Jets should have met with Todd Monken. Like,
Yeah.
look what, but that doesn't seem to be what this particular hire was about. It wasn't about getting the offense from 28th in the league to 22nd in the league and then figuring out. This is almost like we have to lay the groundwork. We have to build the cobblestones on the street before we build up the city. And Aaron Glenn seems to be a guy that they think, even though he's a first-year coach, has been around it enough and has seen that flower build out of the rubble in Detroit firsthand, and also has the backing of a Sean Payton, a Bill Parcells, and many years playing for this Jets team as an all-pro, which is nearly impossible to do wearing that uniform.
All right. Tell me something I don't know about Kliff Kingsbury and Jayden Daniels.
Gosh, Kliff knew this from like day one. So what you need to know is that this whole marriage was almost by accident. Kliff was very interested in the Chicago Bears offensive coordinator job last year. He put a suit and tie on and met with Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus for 8 hours to discuss whether or not he was the next offensive coordinator of the Chicago Bears. And the main reason he was so interested was because Caleb Williams and him had this wonderful, rich relationship for the year they were together at USC. They met with Kliff for 8 hours and they promptly hired Shane Waldron. Okay. He met with Philadelphia and was really interested there and thought, wow, Jalen Hurts has a lot to like and he's about the right stuff. Didn't get that job. It went to Kellen Moore, and to Howie Roseman's credit, called Kliff directly and was like, dude, we loved you, but like, we're going a different direction. Kliff was like, great. Then the Raiders job comes up. No quarterback of note, but he really liked Antonio Pierce and he really liked the idea of building this thing in Vegas. And okay, if we've got the right people and the right juice, there was an issue with the amount of years that he was offered in his contract. At the last second, he backed out. The second he backs out, he gets a call from Dan Quinn, who had taken the job recently, and says, hey, would you be interested in maybe joining me and doing this thing out here in Washington? And Kliff hadn't even thought about it and was like, Jayden Daniels? Hell yeah. So what you don't know is that this was like the fourth swing at it, and then he gets there and it was magic. I put on my top 10 breakout players of the year list before the season. I never put rookies on that list. I put Jayden Daniels one solely on what Kliff was saying, that this guy is built different. He's the first one in the building. Now you could say, well, Kliff had Kyler, so there's obviously some scar tissue there. No. First one in the building. And Kliff told me, I've been around Mahomes. I've been around Manziel. I've been around Kyler. I've been around Davis Webb. I've been around all these guys. There might be no cerebral quarterback out of the gate than what it is with Jayden Daniels. He's about all the right stuff, and there's not a negative word said about him. And that's been going on since April when he walked in the building.
Yeah, it's perfect. And I was skeptical of it. I knew Jayden, so Simmons had me do top 5 most exciting players in football in 2024, and I put Jayden Daniels on. He was the only rookie on there. Reason being is that he was able to go downfield against SEC defenses, which you're not, like CJ Stroud was able to do it for one day, and that suggested that he could play at the level he played at last year. Jayden Daniels did it for an entire season. Like, he was unbelievable. And I've talked before about how much football he played, how many reps. I talked to Zavita Pritchard, their quarterback coach, right before the season, right before he did that pod. And he was like, the amount of data points he has in his brain that we're able to watch, we're able to process, because he was in different offenses, different with different skill guys over 5 years. And we're able to say, hey, he couldn't do this, then he could do this 2 years later. Like, you're not seeing that with for instance, a Drake May, who played 3 years at North Carolina, didn't get the same amount of reps, or 2 years. So he's behind Sam Howell 1 year, but didn't, Jayden Daniels, like, he could have gotten a doctorate, like, at LSU. Like, he was there forever. And so it's just a different type of prospect. And I knew he was going to be exciting day one. And I'm so happy. And I just don't, like, I didn't realize, first of all, like, a lot of my aunts and uncles live in DC, and the way they talk about DC football in the 90s and 80s, to me, I'm not old
rich
enough.
Tradition, man.
It feels like a foreign country.
I know.
And like, I was listening to a pod with Parcells like a year ago, like just an old NFL Films thing. And he was like, "Oh, you know how crazy RFK would get on Monday nights." And I'm like, "No, I
No, I
don't.
don't.
I have
I have
no
no
idea
re-
what you're talking
I
about.
don't know
No,
what you're
no
talking
clue."
about.
And now to see, like, I went to dinner with breakfast with my aunt at an owners meeting in DC like 4 years ago, and Snyder was the next table. And I go, "Hey, Snyder's there. You want to, just look at him?" And she was like, "No." And I was like, "What?" And she was like, "I'm not looking at that guy. F that guy." And I was like,
Wow.
"Okay." And like, you don't unless you're a fan, you don't understand the vitriol. She didn't actually say "f that guy," by the way. Don't quote my aunt on that. Although I have
What's her
multiple
name?
ones.
Aunt
So
what?
so
Aunt what?
no, I just I have multiple. So it's like an aunt familiar with the
We'll leave
situation.
it. We'll leave it big.
Yeah. But last thing, teams, players were. I think we're good at this. We just suggested this. They were hot on for 2025.
Teams that
Like,
I think the
for next year.
Commanders are going to be the hottest media
Yeah,
darling no matter what, but also a
agree.
place that teams are going to want to play for. Dan Quinn's beloved as a coach, and
Agree.
Kingsbury's coming back, and you've got Daniels, and of course you've got this huge salary cap. So
Yeah.
I think Washington is number one by a long, wide margin as far as teams that players are going to want to play for. As far as the AFC goes, I think it's going to be really interesting to see if there's a trickle down effect to what Buffalo did this year without stars like Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis, and found a way to get contributions and production from guys like Mac Hollins and Curtis Samuel and Ty Johnson, who have been around elsewhere. I think Buffalo becomes a really attractive place to play for, despite the weather and the elements.
Any bad teams you see? I mean, like I could see Washington, Tennessee getting better with Cam Ward immediately. I could also see Cleveland.
Maybe.
I don't know if they get a quarterback.
Yeah.
The defense is going to be there. Stefanski's a good coach. I'm wondering if one of those places has a quarterback related renaissance. I think Tennessee's a little bit away because of the roster.
I think what we learn year after year after year, and you know this, Jacksonville's going to have a big signing. And Carolina's going to have a big signing, but like, it's the Frankie Louvous and it's the Zach Ertzes and it's the Ty Johnsons and it's the, Drew Tranquils. It's those guys that end up mattering more than the big fancy, big signing to the team that's been crappy for all these years.
It's never who you think. It's never the first day of free agency guys who end up winning Super Bowls. Because again, go ahead.
Can I give you my one take before we wrap that I've been wanting to get out somewhere? That
Please.
is, you might want to do a whole pod with me and we can have a real blast with this. I have a friend, Todd Dietrapani's his name, full name, no shame in saying it. One of my best friends, Giants fan, beleaguered Giants fan, the classic New Yorker, lives out in Long Island. And his take is that the playoffs shouldn't be played in home stadiums, but the playoff games, just like bowl games and just like the Super Bowl, should be played on neutral fields.
All of them. Wild card games.
All of them.
Okay.
And the reason being, and Kurt Warner, I found an old clip of Kurt Warner almost.
He said on Pardon My Take.
Yeah.
I saw that. Yeah.
The reason being, you grind for 19 weeks or you start preparing for football in March and you do all these workouts and then you get to the biggest game of your season and you're playing on a surface that's akin to Mars or space. And it's all of a sudden some gimmicky goofball game like they had in Philly versus the Rams. And everyone's like, well, then you have to prepare for that. The Rams cannot in any conditions prepare for what they had to play for in Philadelphia. But Philadelphia, no matter what, could prepare to play in LA. It's a take. I'm not saying I advocate for it. It'll never happen. And of course, you earn home field advantage and you get that home field advantage because you win more games than the Rams. But that sport that we saw in the second half of Philadelphia, LA, not exactly the same sport that we saw in September when we watched a game being played in a dome. And do you necessarily want to throw out what all the stuff is and then throw it into that wintry mix? I don't know.
First of all, the players who play in cold weather cities, they deserve something good in their lives. Because the Rams players, players, they're living in Malibu. They're living, the Chargers guys are in Newport Beach. They're having an amazing time. You got to give the Philly guys something. And that's a better advantage in home field. Okay, I'm going to start there. Second is, teams are built Like, you sign a running back knowing that in December and January in cold weather, you're going to need to pound the rock. You understand it. Like, one of the things that always changed my mind on the running back position, especially in the NFC East, is Chris Long was doing a pod, I think it was with Bo Allen, and they were talking about the worst games they some of the lowlights they had. And there was a game where they were it was like week 17, and they had a bunch of injuries, so the veterans had to play the whole game. Even they couldn't rest it. And it's like Zeke Elliott, I don't know, was trying to get some incentives or something, so he's playing the whole game. And it's like 10 degrees, and they're trying to tackle a running back who runs hard in 10-degree weather, and
knowing they've got games coming up the next few weeks.
Get me out of here. I remember the story was that, like, Jason Witten was like, "What are you guys doing in the game?"
Yeah.
But it's like, anyway, that's a diversion here. But what I'm saying is, like, it should suck to play some places. It should suck, and you have to be built for the games. You have to be built for, I'm going to play this way. We're going to make it suck to play us. And that includes the weather. Okay? It's like the Khabib line. I take people to dark waters or deep waters, and they learn about themselves. When you go into New England against Belichick and Brady, you're also going against 12 degree, the darkest, the sun setting at like 2:30 p.m.
We've been in that press box
going
before
into the abyss.
Kevin, I feel like we've called enough AFC championship games where you were at the Wall Street Journal and I was at Fox, and it's like 3:00 and it's dark. And you're like, this is New England. This is football in January. And you just have to be ready for it because they're ready for it.
Can I tell a story about the New England press box? I went to go get a cookie in January 2015.
Okay.
And Ryan Grigson was in the second half of the AFC title game.
That was the Deflategate game. Yep.
Was in the, like, NFL officials area screaming, "This is," and I had I thought it was like a pass interference thing.
Yeah, but it was about deflated balls.
Then I found out. I saw Deflategate start, and I was on the other side of the press box just housing a brownie.
So I was there at that game also, and Grigson brownie aside, the next morning I'm doing a hit at like 7 a.m. for Dan Patrick, and the story hadn't really come out yet because I don't.
Bob Kravitz tweeted it overnight, and no one knew what the extent was.
Gosh, so I'm doing it, and I'm being honest. I'm spinning plates as Patrick is asking me about deflated footballs. I'm like, guys, I haven't done any reporting on this. I have little did I know it would dominate the next 4 months of my life.
That happened to me one time on. I probably shouldn't make light of this, but that happened to me one time with the Ray Rice thing on Outside the Lines. There were all these details that came out in real time.
It was a Monday night game between the Colts and someone else when that happened. Yep.
And I was on Outside the Lines, and so then they were like, "Hey, what can you react to this report?" And I'm like, "I don't know." It was like literally like they were reporting it, and then they didn't tell me what it was because they didn't work for ESPN. And then they were like, "React to this," and I was like, "Well, do you mind telling me what you're saying right now?" Like, I had done all the research, I was prepped, but it was like, okay, well, sometimes live TV is live TV.
Yeah. Sure.
Peter Schrager, you do live TV. Thank you, buddy.
Appreciate you, bro. Thanks for having me on.